The stagecoach door opened and the whole street went silent. She was younger than they expected, prettier too. But no one was looking at her face. They were looking at what she was holding, an 8-month-old boy, fussing against her shoulder, wrapped in a blanket that had seen better days, on a journey neither of them had chosen. Every person on that street waited for Silas Boone to do the sensible thing, the practical thing, the thing any reasonable man would do. He walked toward her instead. What happened next would change everything, for both of them, and for a town that thought it already knew how this story ended. If this story found you today, hit like and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this has traveled. The letter had taken 11 days to reach Santa Fe and another 4 by rider to get out to the Boone Ranch, which sat 8 miles east of the town of Red Rock, in a shallow valley that caught wind from 3 directions and shade from none. By the time Silas read it the first time, the sun had already dropped behind the ridge. By the time he read it the third time, the fire had gone cold. He set the paper on the table and stared at the far wall for a long while. The letter was from a woman named Evelyn Mercer, writing out of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. She had responded to his advertisement in the Eastern Matrimonial Gazette, an advertisement his neighbor Chet Purdy had talked him into running after 2 consecutive years of watching Silas eat alone at every community supper. The advertisement had been 3 sentences long and embarrassing to write. It said he was a rancher, 41 years old, in good health, with land and cattle enough to provide a stable life. It said he was not a handsome man, but an honest one. It said he was looking for a woman of practical nature who would not mind the quiet. Evelyn Mercer had written back 7 months ago. She said she was 29, a widow, with experience keeping a home and a kitchen garden. She said she was not afraid of hard work. She said she didn't mind the quiet either, that in fact she had grown tired of certain kinds of noise. That phrase had stayed with him. Certain kinds of noise. He turned it over in his mind for weeks before writing back, and by the time he did, something had loosened in his chest that he hadn't noticed was tight. They had exchanged 6 letters over those months. He told her about the land, the way it looked in October when the cottonwoods went gold along the creek, the way the sky came apart in colors at dusk that he'd never found words for before and still couldn't quite manage. She'd told him about Harrisburg, about the factory smoke and the crowded streets and the sound of her neighbors through thin walls at all hours of the night. She wrote plainly, without decoration, and that suited him. He had asked her, in the 4th letter, if she had family she was leaving behind. She had answered in the 5th letter that she had no one. He had believed her because she'd written it so simply, like a woman reporting a fact about the weather. Now, reading the 6th letter by lamplight in his cold kitchen, he understood that she had not lied. She had just left something out. "I must tell you something before I board the stage," she wrote, "and I want to tell you plainly rather than arrive and have it be a surprise. I have a son. His name is Noah. He is 8 months old. I should have told you in my first letter, and I understand if this changes your decision. I will not fault you for it. But I want you to know that wherever I go, he goes with me, and I would rather you know that now than to have us both come all that way only to cause more difficulty." Silas read the letter 4 more times before he went to bed, and in the morning he read it once more while his coffee went cold. He thought about writing back. He even got out paper and set it on the table. He sat there for nearly an hour with the pen in his hand and then put it away, because she was already on the stage by now, or would be within days, and there wasn't time for a letter to reach her, and besides, he didn't know what he would say. He did not sleep well the next 9 nights. Board shut? Red Rock was not a large town, maybe 300 souls counting the homesteaders in the surrounding country. And it had the particular character of a place where people paid close attention to one another's business for lack of anything more interesting to attend to. There was a general store run by a man named Harlan Briggs and his wife Dottie, a livery, a small church, a saloon that the church pretended not to notice, a land office, and a doctor who came through once a month from the larger settlement of Cutter's Crossing. The arrival of Silas Boone's mail-order bride had been the subject of considerable conversation for some time. The women of the town had opinions. Most of those opinions, delivered in the careful language of concern, amounted to skepticism that any decent woman would travel across the country to marry a man she'd never met, and a rancher to boot, one who lived out on that lonesome stretch of flat with nothing for company but cattle and the particular silence that settled over the valley in January like something that would never lift. Mabel Greer, who was the wife of the feed store owner and considered herself the informal conscience of Red Rock, had said at the last quilting circle that she hoped the woman understood what she was getting into. "Silas is a good enough man," she'd said, threading her needle, "but that ranch would wear down a person, wear them right down to nothing." No one had disagreed. So when the eastbound Butterfield stage rolled into Red Rock on a Wednesday afternoon in late March, raising a long plume of dust down the main street, there were more people watching from doorways and windows than could plausibly explain their presence there by chance. Silas was already standing at the edge of the street. He had driven in that morning, which in itself was unusual. He generally came to town once every 2 weeks for supplies, and he had spent the better part of the morning sitting on the bench in front of Briggs's store, pretending to read a week-old newspaper while Harlan Briggs gave him sidelong looks that Silas chose not to acknowledge. He had told no one about the letter. He didn't know how to explain what he was about to do, partly because he didn't fully understand it himself. He had stayed awake many of those 9 nights going over the practical arithmetic of the situation, which came out wrong every time he ran it. He didn't know anything about raising an infant. He had no particular preparation for a child. The ranch was no place for a baby. These were facts. And yet, when the stagecoach slowed and the driver dropped down and pulled the door open, and Silas saw the woman step out into the afternoon light with the child wrapped against her shoulder, something in his chest made a decision without consulting the rest of him. She was slight, with dark hair pinned up under a gray traveling hat that had seen better years. Her dress was clean, but worn. She had her left hand holding the door frame to steady herself on the step down, and her right arm held the baby so naturally and so completely that it looked like the baby was part of how she was built. Her face was pale from the journey and tight around the eyes from exhaustion or nerves, or both, and she stood on the street and blinked in the harsh New Mexico sun and looked at the small crowd of people who were trying not to appear to be staring at her. Her eyes found him. He wasn't hard to spot. He was the tallest man there, and the only one standing alone, and he supposed she'd expected that. He watched her face, watched her try to read him the way he was trying to read her, and he saw the moment she braced herself for whatever was coming, her chin coming up slightly, her arm tightening almost imperceptibly around the boy. He walked toward her. The crowd went quiet in the way that crowds do when they think something significant is about to happen, and they don't want to miss a word of it. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. He stopped a couple of feet from her and turned his hat in his hands. "Mr. Boone." Her voice was even, controlled. She was not going to let him see her frightened, that much was clear. He looked at the baby. 8 months, she'd said. The boy was awake, dark-eyed, staring up at Silas with the solemn attention that babies gave to things they couldn't yet categorize. His face was flushed. He'd been crying recently from the look of him. "He made it all right?" Silas asked. She blinked. That wasn't the question she'd been expecting. "He's tired," she said carefully. "The journey was difficult for him." "For you too, I expect." "I'm fine," she said. And it was so obviously not quite true that Silas almost smiled. He looked up from the baby and met her eyes. Whatever she was looking for in his face, she didn't seem to find it. Or maybe she found something she hadn't expected, because the brace in her shoulders shifted slightly, just a fraction. "I got your letter," he said. "I know it was late," she said. I should have—" "Mrs. Mercer." He said her name quietly, to stop her. "I offered you a home. That offer includes your son." She stared at him. He could feel the crowd listening, feel Mabel Greer's particular silence somewhere behind him. "You don't have to—" "Shh," she started. "I know I don't have to," he said. He kept his voice level. He wasn't making a speech. He was just saying what was true. "I'm telling you what I intend." She was quiet for a moment. The baby shifted in her arms, made a small, unhappy sound, and she adjusted him with the automatic ease of a woman who'd been doing it long enough that she didn't notice she was doing it. "All right," she said finally. Her voice was not quite steady. "All right," he agreed. He reached for her travel bag. There were 2 battered cases sitting beside the stagecoach, one with a broken leather strap, and picked them both up. "The wagon's at the livery. We've got an hour of light if we start soon." She followed him, and behind them, the entire street breathed out at once. The wagon ride out to the ranch was not what either of them had imagined for the beginning of an acquaintance. The baby, whose name was Noah and who had been tolerably quiet through the later part of the journey east, decided that he had been patient long enough and began to cry about 20 minutes outside of town with a conviction that suggested he'd been storing it up. It was not a small sound. For a creature of his size, he was remarkably determined about it. Evelyn bounced him and murmured to him and tried nursing him, which helped briefly and then didn't. She looked exhausted in a way that went past tired, a deep, accumulated kind of exhaustion that didn't fix with a night's sleep. Silas drove and did not offer suggestions because he didn't have any. He knew cattle. He knew horses. He knew how to read weather and fix fence and coax a struggling pump back into function. He did not know what to do about an unhappy infant, and he understood instinctively that pretending he did would be worse than useless. After a while, the baby wound down from crying to fussing, and then, with the abruptness that infants sometimes managed, fell asleep. Evelyn let out a long, slow breath. "Thank you," she said, "for not trying to help." He glanced over at her. "I didn't know how." "I know," she said. "That was the thank you." He looked back at the road. After a moment, something loosened at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the direction of one. They rode in silence for a while. The desert in the late afternoon had a quality he'd always found hard to explain to people who hadn't seen it. The way the light came low and orange across the flats, making long shadows of the scrub and turning the distant mesas a deep, complicated red. He watched her take it in out of the corner of his eye. "It's different from Pennsylvania," she said finally. "Most things out here are." She was quiet again. Then, "The advertisement said you had cattle. About 200 head right now. Was over 300 before last winter." "What happened last winter?" "Cold came early. Lost some to the cold, some to disease." He paused. "It's not an easy country." "You didn't put that in the advertisement. Didn't seem like a selling point." She turned to look at him. He kept his eyes on the road, but he could feel her studying him with the careful attention of someone trying to figure out what they'd gotten themselves into. He understood that impulse. "You could have written back," she said, "when you got my letter. You could have said it was too much to ask." "I could have." "Why didn't you?" He thought about it. The honest answer was complicated, and he wasn't sure he could make it make sense. But he'd already decided that whatever else this arrangement was going to be, it wasn't going to start with him not saying what was true. "Because you deserved to know before you got on the stage," he said, "not after." She looked at him for another moment, then looked back at the desert. "It came too late for that." "I know." He shifted the reins in his hands. "That's why I'm saying it now." Us. The ranch house was not impressive. Silas knew that. He had looked at it that morning the way a person looked at things before someone else was going to see them, and he had noted everything that was missing or broken or simply the result of a man living alone for many years without much attention to his surroundings. The house was solid. He had built it himself, and he'd built it to stand, but it was also spare to the point of emptiness, with bare floors and rough furniture and a kitchen that held a good iron stove and not much else of warmth. He helped her down from the wagon with the baby and carried her cases inside and stood in the middle of the kitchen while she looked around. She did not say anything for a long moment. "I can make changes," he said, "to the house. Whatever you need." "I'll need a few days to see what's needed," she said. Her voice was neutral. He couldn't tell what she thought. "Of course." She looked at the stove. "Is the flue sound?" "I cleaned it in November." "And the water?" "There's a pump at the back. The well's deep, never runs dry, even in August." She nodded like she was filing these things away. The baby stirred against her shoulder. "The bedroom," she said. "Where is it?" "Down the hall. There's only the one." He stopped. "I'll sleep in the barn." She turned and looked at him with an expression that was difficult to read, not quite surprise, not quite relief, something in between. "You don't—" she started. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "we haven't been married 5 minutes. We've only met each other twice, counting this moment and the one in the street. I'll sleep in the barn." Something shifted in her face. "That's not necessary." "I think it is," he said, "and I think you think so too. There's no shame in it." He moved toward the door. "I'll bring some wood in before full dark. The nights get cold." He went out, and behind him he heard nothing. Not argument, not thanks, just silence, which was, He was beginning to understand how Evelyn Mercer processed things she hadn't expected. She found the barn better than she'd expected. This thought surprised her when she had it, standing at the window in the morning with Noah against her hip, watching Silas come out of the barn and cross the yard toward the house. He moved like a man who was used to his own company, not hurried, not dawdling, just purposeful, the way people moved when no one was watching and they didn't feel the need to perform anything for anyone. She'd slept better than she had in weeks. That also surprised her. She had put Noah down in the middle of the bed, surrounded by a bolster she'd rolled from a blanket, the way she'd done in every unfamiliar place since he was born, and she'd watched him breathe in the unfamiliar dark and tried to decide how she felt about all of this. The truth was, she didn't know yet. She'd made a decision out of desperation and limited options, and desperation was not a good lens for seeing things clearly. Silas Boone was not what she'd built in her imagination over those months of letters. Not that she'd built much. She'd held herself to careful expectations, or tried to. But the man in her letters, and the man who'd stood on that street in Red Rock and said that offer includes your son without anger or performance. Just fact. She was still working out how those two things fit together. She heard his boots on the step and put the coffee on. He came in and stopped just inside the door, the way a man stopped in someone else's kitchen. "Morning," he said. "Good morning." She nodded at the stove. "Coffee'll be ready in a minute?" He took off his hat and hung it on the peg by the door. She noticed he looked at Noah before he sat down. A quick look. The way you'd check on something you were keeping track of. "How'd he sleep?" he asked. "Better than I expected." She poured the coffee and set it in front of him. "He usually wakes twice in the night. Last night, only once." Silas wrapped both hands around the cup. "Maybe the quiet." "Maybe." She poured her own cup and sat down across from him. "He's used to the city, lots of noise." Noah chose that moment to lunge forward from her lap toward the table, grasping at nothing in particular with the focused intention of a creature discovering that the world was full of things to grab. She caught him with one hand, her coffee cup with the other, and looked up to find Silas watching with an expression she couldn't categorize. "He always like that?" he asked. "He's been like that since he could reach," she said. "Wants everything. That'll either serve him well out here or cause him a great deal of trouble." "Probably both," she said. And Silas Boone, for the first time since she'd met him, smiled fully. Not the almost smile from the night before, but an actual one, brief and a little surprised, like it had gotten away from him. It changed his face considerably. The town's reaction settled in over the following days like weather coming in from the northwest, gradual at first, then harder to ignore. Evelyn learned about it not because anyone said anything directly to her. No one was that open about it, not yet. But because she could read rooms. She'd grown up poor in a city that had plenty of opinions about poor people, and she had learned early how to read the particular silence that meant people were thinking things they'd decided not to say to your face. When she came into Briggs's general store 3 days after arriving to pick up some things she needed, flour, a bit of salt pork, needles, and thread, Dottie Briggs was perfectly pleasant, perfectly helpful, and told her 3 separate times how brave she was for coming all this way. The word brave was doing a lot of work in those sentences that had nothing to do with courage. 2 women she didn't know were shopping in the dry goods section. They stopped talking when she came in and didn't start again until she'd moved to the far side of the store. She bought what she needed and went out into the bright street and stood by the wagon for a moment, Noah on her hip, and let the sun hit her face and breathed. She was not going to cry about it. She'd made her decision and she was standing in it. What she hadn't expected when she came back to the ranch and told Silas what had happened, told him plainly, not making drama of it, was that he'd go quiet in a particular way that was different from his ordinary quiet. This quiet had an edge to it. "The Briggs women have opinions about most things," he said after a moment. "I don't blame them for being curious," she said. "It's a small town. I'd be curious too." "It's not curiosity, I'd call it." "What would you call it?" He looked at her. "I'd call it people deciding what's true before they know anything." She was quiet. Then, "That's not going to change just because we want it to." "No," he agreed. "It changes because we prove them wrong." She looked at him, at this man she barely knew, who slept in his own barn and drank his coffee with both hands and had made a promise to a stranger on a public street without hesitation or performance. "I intend to," she said, and she meant it. The days built a rhythm slowly, the way rhythms did when two unfamiliar people were trying to share a space without colliding. Silas woke before light and went to the cattle and the horses and the 100 small repairs that a working ranch generated daily. Evelyn woke when Noah woke, which was earlier than she would have liked and later than Silas's rising, and she fell to work in the house with the focused practicality of someone who has survived on her own long enough to know that sentiment was less useful than function. The house was in more disrepair than she'd initially seen in the fading light of her arrival. The kitchen window had a gap in the frame that let cold air finger through at night. One of the floorboards in the hall was soft and would eventually go through entirely. The curtain rod in the bedroom was a nail with a piece of rope strung on it, which had apparently seemed like enough at the time. The garden plot out back had been broken once, years ago by the look of the soil, and then abandoned, and the weeds had moved back in and made themselves completely at home. She did not complain about any of this. She identified each problem, decided what she could fix immediately and what would have to wait, and worked through the list in order. Silas noticed. He didn't say much about it. He wasn't a man who narrated what he observed, but she could tell he noticed, the way his eyes moved over what she'd done when he came in at noon for coffee. The gap in the window frame was filled with cut cloth pressed tight and sealed with pine resin from the tree line. The soft floorboard had been reinforced from underneath with a piece of wood she'd found in the scrap pile by the barn. The curtain rod was still a rope, but she'd hemmed a piece of muslin she found in the bottom of one of her cases, and it hung properly now, so there was that. The garden was the bigger project. She started on it the 4th day with Noah in a cloth carrier she'd made herself months ago for exactly this purpose, tied against her chest so her hands were free. The ground was hard and full of roots, and she'd borrowed a hoe from the tool shed without asking, which she hadn't thought to worry about until she saw Silas watching her from the fence line. He walked over. She expected him to say something about the tools, or about whether this was a good idea, or something else that would require her to be patient with someone who hadn't yet understood that she was going to work. Instead, he looked at the ground she'd turned and said, "The west end gets more water from the pump runoff. Better to start there." She looked at the west end of the plot, considered it, and moved her operation without a word. He stood there another moment and then went back to his fence. That evening, he brought her a second hoe from the barn that was better balanced than the one she'd been using, and set it against the house without comment. At night, after the baby was down, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with the lamp and wrote in the small journal she'd kept since her husband died. Not a diary exactly, not feelings and impressions, but practical notes, a habit she'd developed when she'd had to keep track of money so carefully that every transaction had to be recorded. Now she wrote down what she'd observed about the land, about what grew here, about what would need doing. She wrote about the water table and the angle of the sun on the garden plot. She wrote about the town and the women in Briggs's store. She wrote, after the 2nd week, "He is not what I expected. Not warmer, exactly. I would not describe him as warm, not in any easy way. But he is without pretense. I have never met a man so entirely without pretense. I don't know yet what to make of that. I find that I am not afraid of it." She almost wrote more, but didn't. She closed the journal and listened to the wind, which out here came from everywhere at once, and she had not yet learned to read it, whether it meant weather or just the land talking to itself. She would learn. She was determined to learn. From the barn she heard nothing, as she had heard nothing on any other night. But she knew he was there. There was something in that, in knowing that the silence was occupied, not empty, that she was not yet ready to name. The lamp burned low and she let it go out rather than trim it, because she was more tired than she'd realized, and sleep had become something she couldn't afford to waste. And in the bedroom down the hall, Noah slept through the whole night for the first time since they'd left Harrisburg, and she didn't know that until morning. And when she realized it, she stood in the doorway and pressed her hand to her mouth and held it there until she was sure she wasn't going to do anything she'd feel foolish about later. The land was hard, and the town was uncertain, and she had married a man she barely knew, but Noah had slept, and the garden was started, and the window didn't let the cold in anymore. She went to make the coffee. The fever came on a Tuesday. Evelyn knew it before she had a name for it, the way Noah's skin went from warm to hot between one feeding and the next, the way his cry changed pitch, lost its demand, and took on something smaller and more frightened. She'd heard that cry before, in the weeks after he was born, when he'd come into the world already struggling, and the sound of it now put a cold hand on the back of her neck. She brought him into the kitchen and laid him on the table in the afternoon light, pressing the back of her wrist to his forehead, then his chest, then the side of his neck. Hot. All of it hot. "All right," she said, to him or herself. She wasn't sure. All right. She'd dealt with sick children before, her neighbor's children in Harrisburg, her younger brothers when she was growing up, the way illness moved through close quarters like it had somewhere to be and would not be delayed. She knew what to do with a fever: fluids, cool cloths, keep him still. She knew all of that. What she did not know was whether what she was looking at was ordinary sickness, the kind infants got from new places and changes in water and the accumulated stress of a long journey, or something worse. The desert had diseases she hadn't grown up with. The water here was different. The air was different. Everything was different, and the nearest doctor was 30-some miles away in Cutter's Crossing, and she'd been told he came through once a month, and that month's visit had been 2 weeks ago. She wrapped a cloth in the water from the pump, cold, clean, mercifully cold, and laid it across Noah's forehead and held it there while he fussed at her hands. She was still standing there, steady and focused, and not letting herself think too far ahead, when she heard Silas come in from the yard. He stopped in the doorway. She didn't look up. "He's got a fever, been coming on since this morning." He came into the kitchen and stood on the other side of the table. She could feel him looking at Noah. The particular quality of a man who didn't know what he was seeing and was honest enough not to pretend otherwise. "How bad?" he asked. "I don't know yet." She re-wet the cloth. "Could be nothing. Could be more. I've been through enough of these to know you can't tell in the first few hours." "Is there something you need?" She looked up then, briefly. He was watching her with that particular steadiness of his, not hovering, not trying to solve anything, just there, present. "Not yet," she said. "I'll tell you if that changes." He nodded and didn't move, which was not the same as being in the way. He stood at the edge of the kitchen and let her work. And she found, to her own mild surprise, that she didn't mind it. That night was long. Noah's fever climbed through the evening, peaked somewhere in the deepest part of the night, and broke around dawn in the way fevers sometimes did. Suddenly, with the thoroughness of a storm clearing off, leaving the child wrung out and damp and mercifully, exhaustedly asleep. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed with her hand on his chest, feeling it rise and fall, and didn't move for a long time. At some point she heard movement in the kitchen, the sound of the pump, then the stove. She came out to find Silas at the stove with his back to her, making coffee, still dressed from the night before. She did not know how long he'd been awake. She did not know if he'd slept at all. He turned when he heard her and looked at her face, which apparently told him what he needed to know. "He's better," he said. It was not quite a question. "Fever broke." Her voice came out rougher than she intended. "He's sleeping." He set a cup of coffee on the table in front of the chair nearest her and sat down across from it, leaving the chair for her. She sat. "How long were you up?" she asked. "A while." "You should have slept. There was nothing you could do." He looked at his own cup. "I know that." She understood then that he hadn't stayed up because he thought he could help. He'd stayed up because being awake seemed like the right thing when someone else's child was sick, even if the child was not his and the woman was still more stranger than wife. He'd stayed up because that was what you did. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup, which was what he always did, she'd noticed, and she thought that was an interesting thing to notice, and then she was too tired to think much more about it. "Thank you," she said. He didn't say it was nothing, which she'd expected, and she was glad he didn't. Kate. Noah recovered slowly over the better part of a week. He was listless and difficult in the way babies were after an illness, demanding and impossible to satisfy by turns, wanting to be held but fussing when he was held, sleeping in short stretches that didn't add up to enough. Evelyn ran on less sleep than she'd had even in the worst weeks after he was born, and the toll of it showed in ways she couldn't fully conceal. Her hands shook a little in the mornings before she'd had coffee. She misjudged distances, knocked things off shelves, startled at sounds. She lost her words sometimes in the middle of a sentence and had to circle back for them. Silas saw it. She knew he saw it because of the particular care with which he didn't comment on it. The way he took over tasks at the edge of her awareness without announcement. The water brought in before she'd noticed the barrel was low. The fire banked in the evening so she didn't have to manage it before bed. Supper. One night when she'd lost track of time tending to Noah and looked up to find he'd made something plain and terrible from what was available in the kitchen and set it on the table without ceremony or apology. "This is awful," she said, tasting it. "I know," he said. "I'm not a cook." "I wasn't complaining," she said. "I was just noting it." "There's a difference?" "There is," she said, and ate it anyway, all of it, because she was hungry enough that awful was better than nothing. He watched her eat with an expression she was getting better at reading, not quite satisfaction, but something adjacent to it, the look of a man who had done the one thing available to him and found it acceptable. She was starting to understand that this was how Silas Boone operated. He identified what could be done and did it without drama or credit-seeking, and what couldn't be done, he left alone. It was a practical way to exist and not a cold one, though it could look cold from the outside. She had lived around men who said a great deal and did very little, and men who said almost nothing and did what was needed, and she had no trouble knowing which she preferred. Top 10. The garden came in slowly through April, and tending it gave her something to do with her hands in the hours when Noah was cooperative and she could strap him to her chest and work. The west end of the plot, as Silas had noted, got better water, and the kitchen herbs she'd planted there were taking sage and thyme and a few sprigs of mint from seeds she'd carried from Pennsylvania wrapped in oilcloth. The vegetable rows were more uncertain. The soil was different from anything she'd grown things in before, alkaline and sandy in stretches, and she was learning its character the hard way, by trial. She didn't mind the trial. She minded failing at things, but learning was different from failing, and she was clear on which was which. What she minded, more than the hard soil and the recalcitrant seeds, was the town. She'd been back to Red Rock twice more since that first trip to Briggs's store, and both times had confirmed what she'd felt the first time, a specific quality of observation that had judgment braided into it. She was not invisible. She was noticed with the particular attention given to things that hadn't yet been decided about. The second visit, she'd been in the dry goods section when she overheard Mabel Greer on the other side of the fabric display talking to a woman she didn't recognize. She caught only a few words. Enough. Poor Silas, that child. Another man's. She kept her face neutral and bought what she'd come for and left, and didn't tell Silas about it because she didn't see what good it would do. But she told him about the third visit, which was different in kind. She'd been at the counter with Harlan Briggs, paying for a coil of rope and some additional seedlings she'd found she could get for a small price, when a man she didn't know came in with two others and started talking to Briggs while she was still standing there, speaking at a volume that made clear he didn't mind her hearing. "Heard from Chet Purdy that Boone's woman is turning the whole place upside down," the man said. He was heavy-set, wearing a rancher's jacket that had seen many seasons, planting a garden, repairing the house. "Is that so?" Briggs said, his eyes cutting to Evelyn and then away. "Chet figures she'll last till summer, once she sees what summer does out here." Evelyn counted out her coins carefully and did not look up. "Excuse me," she said when she was done, and walked out into the street. She was halfway to the wagon before she realized she was shaking, and she stood by the wheel and breathed, with Noah observing her from the carrier with his dark, serious eyes. And she thought, I have outlasted worse opinions than Chet Purdy's. That evening she told Silas because she had decided she wasn't going to hide the town from him. If they were going to survive this, and she intended to survive it, he needed to know what they were working against. He listened with his hands around his coffee cup, his eyes on the table. "Who was the man?" he asked. "Heavy set, dark jacket, older. I don't know his name." "Sound like Deke Halliwell." He set down his cup. "He and Chet have been drinking together since before I settled here. Neither of them have anything better to do with their mouths than run them." "It's not just them," she said. "You know it's not just them." "I know. They're waiting for me to fail." He looked up at her. "Let them wait." It was so simply said without anger or bluster, just a fact delivered flatly, that she almost laughed. She didn't, but it was closer than she'd come in a while. "You're not worried?" she said. "About what they think? About any of it? About me? About whether this was a mistake?" He was quiet for a moment, which, with Silas, was not evasion. It was him actually thinking about what to say, which was a habit she was coming to trust. "I worry about the cattle," he said. "I worry about the weather. I worry about whether that pump is going to hold through the summer." He looked at her steadily. "I don't worry about whether you can handle this country. I've watched you for 3 weeks. She held his gaze. 3 weeks isn't very long. It's long enough to see some things. She didn't ask what things. She thought maybe she already knew, or at least part of it, and the rest she could wait on. What? April became May, and May had a meanness to it that she hadn't expected. The temperature climbed fast, and the wind came with it. Not a cooling wind, but a scoured one, dry and searching, pulling moisture out of everything it touched. The garden required more water than she'd planned for. The herbs were holding, but the squash was struggling, and she spent part of each morning hauling buckets from the pump to supplement the runoff. Noah was on his feet now, or trying to be. 8 months had become 9 and then 10, and he had discovered that standing while holding on to things was the most important achievement possible, and he pursued it with a relentlessness that required her to childproof a ranch house that had never been childproofed. She moved tools up, blocked the kitchen steps with a length of board, and spent an increasing portion of each day redirecting him away from things that could hurt him with the patient repetition that motherhood had installed in her. He was everywhere she wasn't looking. That was what 10-month-olds did. Silas watched this development with the quiet fascination of a man encountering something he had genuinely no context for. She caught him once standing at the door of the main room, watching Noah work his way along the edge of the settle. 3 careful side steps, and then a sit-down that was more controlled fall than intention, and the expression on Silas's face was unguarded in a way she hadn't seen before. Not smiling exactly, but arrested, his attention completely held. Noah looked up from the floor, found Silas, and pointed at him with the blunt authority of a person who had recently discovered pointing. Silas looked at the pointing finger, and then at Evelyn. "Is that something he does to everyone?" he asked. "He points at things that interest him," she said. "That's what he does lately." "What does it mean when he does it?" She kept her face neutral. "I believe it means he's interested in you." Silas looked back at Noah. Noah was still pointing, waiting with baby patience for this information to produce some kind of result. Silas crossed the room and crouched down to Noah's level, which was an awkward thing for a man his size to do, and said, "What do you want?" Noah grabbed his finger. Silas stayed absolutely still for a moment. Then very carefully, he closed his hand around the small fist, just enough so he wasn't pulling away. Evelyn went back to what she was doing and did not remark on it at all. The difficulty with the town arrived in a direct form in mid-May, when a man named Roy Ferris came to the ranch. She was alone when he arrived. Silas was out on the north range with a fence line that had given way, and she saw the rider coming from a quarter-mile out, the way you could see things coming out here before they arrived, which she was learning to value. She picked Noah up from the yard and stood on the porch and waited. Ferris was a lean man with a sun-weathered face and the look of someone accustomed to delivering news that wasn't his to deliver. He took his hat off when he reached the porch, which was polite enough, and said he was an acquaintance of Silas's, which may have been true. "You're the new Mrs. Boone," he said. "I am." "Heard you'd settled in." He turned his hat in his hands. "Mind if I speak plainly?" "Please," she said. "There's been some talk in town about your situation." He glanced at Noah. "About the boy." "I'm aware there's been talk," she said. "People are concerned for Silas," he said. "They feel he may have been misled, entering into an arrangement expecting one thing and finding another." She looked at him. She kept her arms steady around Noah, who was unimpressed by the stranger and was leaning backward to look at the sky. "Did Silas ask you to come out here?" she asked. A pause. "No." "Did anyone in Silas's family ask you to come?" "He hasn't got family to speak of." "Then who exactly asked you to come?" Ferris shifted his weight. "Folks in town, neighbors, people who look out for one another." "I see," she said. She kept her voice even, which took some doing. "Mr. Ferris, I appreciate that you came in person rather than simply talking about us. That's more consideration than most have shown. But what happens on this ranch between myself and my husband is a matter for us and not for the town, and I'd ask you to take that thought back with you when you go." He blinked. This was apparently not the response he'd been expecting. "Mrs. Boone, I mean that respectfully," she said. "Good afternoon." She went back inside and closed the door and stood in the kitchen with Noah on her hip, and her heart going considerably faster than she'd allowed her face to show. She heard him sit on his horse for a moment outside, but she could feel it, that particular silence, and then ride away. Noah patted her face with his palm. She turned and pressed her forehead against his temple. "We're all right," she said. "We're fine." She wasn't entirely sure which of them she was telling. When Silas came back at the end of the day, she told him about Ferris. She told him matter-of-factly, the way she told him things, and watched his face close down in a way she'd seen before. Not anger exactly, but a drawing in, a kind of cold stillness. "What did you say to him?" he asked. She told him. He was quiet for a moment, then, "You should have let me be here. You weren't here. I know that." He looked at the table. "I don't like you dealing with that alone." "I'm capable of dealing with it alone," she said. "I have been dealing with things alone for almost 2 years. That doesn't mean you should have to." The words landed quietly and sat there. She didn't have an immediate answer for them, and he didn't seem to require one. Oops. June brought heat that she hadn't been prepared for. She had thought she understood heat. Pennsylvania summers could be brutal, airless, and sticky. But this was a different thing entirely. This was a heat that had intention. It pressed down on everything from early morning to long after dark. A dry, absolute heat that made the air shimmer and turned the ground to something like iron. The cattle drifted to whatever shade they could find and moved as little as possible, which she sympathized with. Noah hated it. He'd been a reasonably good-tempered baby in cooler weather, but the heat made him fretful and difficult to soothe, and his sleep deteriorated, and so did hers. She moved their sleeping to the coolest part of the house, draped wet cloths in the windows to catch whatever breeze existed, kept him in as little clothing as was practical, and spent a part of each night awake listening to him fuss and wondering if he was getting enough water. She was also getting less food into him than she needed to. The heat depressed his appetite in the way it depressed everything, and she worried about it constantly, in the low-level way she worried about most things. Not panic, just a steady, wearing vigilance. She lost weight she didn't have to lose. She could see it in the way her clothes fit, or stopped fitting, and she noted it the way she noted things that needed attention but had to wait. It was Silas who brought it up, which surprised her. They were eating supper one evening in the last of the light. She'd learned that cooking earlier, before the stove could make the house unbearable, was better than cooking in the dark heat of evening. And she'd eaten what was on her plate because wasting food was not something she did, but she'd eaten slowly and without much interest, and apparently he'd been watching. "You're not eating enough," he said. She looked up. "I'm eating. Not enough." She put down her fork. "Silas." "It's not a criticism," he said. "I'm just noting it." Which was exactly what she had said about his terrible cooking, months ago, and she recognized it being returned to her. "The heat takes my appetite," she said. "The heat takes a lot of things," he said. "But you're doing the work of 2 people and eating less than you were when you arrived, and I can see it." She sat with this. She wasn't used to being seen in this way, not by anyone who hadn't known her for years. The matter-of-fact quality of it was both more comfortable and more unsettling than she would have expected. "I'll manage," she said. "I know you will." He moved the bread plate toward her. "But you don't have to manage alone if you don't want to." She looked at the bread plate. She took a piece. It was such a small thing, such a completely ordinary thing, moving a plate a foot across a table. But she ate the bread, and the tightness across her shoulders released a fraction, and she thought, this is what it might look like to not do it all yourself. The thought was strange and not entirely comfortable, but it was there. The thing that changed in June was not one thing but the accumulation of many. It was Noah pulling himself to standing at Silas's leg one morning, while Silas was at the kitchen table and looking up at him with complete expectation, and Silas reaching down and letting Noah use his hand to balance without a word. It was the night Evelyn fell asleep in the chair with Noah in her arms and woke to find a blanket over both of them that hadn't been there before. It was the afternoon Silas spent 2 hours fixing the garden fence after a stray animal had gotten in and damaged her squash rows, repairing it more thoroughly than the original fence had ever been built. It was the conversation they had on the porch one evening when the heat had finally, briefly relented, and the sky was doing what New Mexico skies did at dusk, turning colors she still didn't have proper words for. And Noah was asleep, and there was nothing that needed doing immediately, which was rare enough that they both noticed it. They sat on the porch step, not quite side by side, with enough distance that neither of them felt crowded. The desert settled into its night sounds. "Do you miss Pennsylvania?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "I miss things about it," she said. "I miss that I knew how it worked, knew who to trust, what to expect from the weather, where to go when I needed things." She looked out at the darkening flat. "I don't miss the noise, and I don't miss being somewhere I couldn't afford to stay." He was quiet. "Do you ever want to go somewhere else?" she asked. "No," he said, without hesitation. "You've always been here?" "Came out here when I was 24, worked for another rancher for 3 years, saved what I could, and bought this land." He paused. "It was in worse shape than it looks now, which gives you some scale." "What made you come west in the first place?" He took a moment with that. "I wasn't much good at being somewhere with a lot of people telling me what to do," he said. "And out here, there's nobody to tell you what to do." Which sounds like freedom, and is, except that it's also everything that goes wrong being entirely your responsibility. "That's not so different from anywhere else," she said. "No," he agreed. "I guess it's not." She looked at her hands in her lap. The garden dirt was still under her nails, which she hadn't been able to entirely fix. "Silas," she said. "Yeah. I want you to know that I understand what you did. In March. On that street." She looked at him. He was looking at the middle distance, but she could tell he was listening. "There weren't many men who would have done it. I don't think you know how few." He was quiet for a long moment. "You would have managed," he said finally. "You'd have figured something out." "Maybe," she said, "but I'm glad I didn't have to." He didn't say anything, but he didn't look away either, and in the long quiet between them, something settled. Not resolved, not finished, but settled, the way ground settled after rain moved through. Somewhere out on the flat, a nightbird called, and the last of the light gave up and let the dark come in. She didn't go inside for a while, and neither did he. The summer did not break gently. It left the way it had come, without apology. And by the time September moved in, the land had a different character to it, cooler at the edges of the day, with mornings that smelled of something other than baked earth. The garden had survived, which was more than Evelyn had counted on in June when the heat was at its worst. The squash rows that the stray animal had damaged came back partial but real. The herbs were established. The kitchen smelled like something other than a bachelor's house, and had for some time. Noah was walking. He had taken his first real steps in the last week of August, 3 of them, lurching and triumphant, between the settle and the kitchen table, before sitting down hard on the floor and looking up with an expression that said he understood he had just done something significant and was waiting for confirmation. Evelyn had confirmed it. Silas, who had been in the doorway with a coffee cup in his hand and had seen the whole thing without apparently planning to, confirmed it in his own way, by crouching down and holding out his hand so Noah had something to walk toward if he wanted to try again. Noah had tried again. He'd made it 4 steps that time. This was the texture of their life by September. Not easy, not resolved, but layered in a way that early spring had not been. There were still things unspoken between Silas and Evelyn, things that lived in the careful distances they kept and the precise way they navigated sharing a house without quite sharing it. The particular politeness of 2 people who had developed real regard for each other and were not sure yet what to do with that information. But underneath the careful distances, something had shifted, and they both knew it, and neither of them had pushed on it directly because some things needed to arrive in their own time. What arrived first, instead, was trouble. It started at the land office. Silas had gone into Red Rock on a Thursday in the second week of September to pay the quarterly land tax and pick up supplies, a routine trip he'd made without incident more times than he could count. Evelyn had stayed at the ranch with Noah, who was in the phase of walking where he needed watching every minute of the day, and going to town was more exhausting than useful. He came back in the late afternoon with the wagon and the supplies and a particular set to his jaw that she'd learned to read. "What happened?" she said. He unhitched the horse before he answered, which told her it was something he was organizing in his head first. "Wade Alcott," he said when he came into the kitchen. "I don't know him. Land speculator. Runs the Alcott Company out of Cutter's Crossing. Buys up distressed ranch land, sells it to Eastern investors." Silas set his hat on the peg. "He was at the land office when I went in. Had some papers." She waited. "He's been buying land on the south end of the valley," Silas said. 4 parcels in the last 8 months. All ranches that went under in the bad winter." "Your land?" "Not yet." He sat down at the table. "But he came over and introduced himself, very pleasant, and mentioned that if I ever found myself in a difficult position, his words, he'd be interested in talking." Evelyn sat down across from him. "What kind of difficult position?" "The kind where a man has taken on more obligation than he anticipated." He looked at her steadily. "He said that. More obligation than anticipated." She was quiet for a moment, understanding what she was hearing. "He knows about Noah," she said. "Everybody in the valley knows about Noah. He thinks we're struggling." "He thinks I'm vulnerable," Silas said, which was a different and more precise thing. "He thinks a man who took on a woman and another man's child is a man who might be looking for a way out." "Are you?" she asked. She kept her voice level. He looked at her. "No." "Then what are you going to do?" He was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to watch him. I want to know what he bought and how he bought it, and whether the men who sold to him did it willingly." She looked at him. "You think they didn't?" "I think 4 ranches in 8 months in a valley this size is a pattern," he said, "and I think Wade Alcott didn't get where he is by waiting politely for opportunity." She thought about Alcott for the next several days in the background of everything else she was doing, the way she thought about most worrying things. Not obsessively, but steadily, turning the shape of the problem over when her hands were occupied and her mind had room. She'd grown up around enough money trouble to recognize its patterns. She knew what it looked like when someone was working a plan that other people hadn't seen yet, and what Silas had described had that shape to it. What she did not do was let it paralyze her. What she did instead was ask questions. On her next trip into Red Rock, she went without Silas this time, with Noah in the wagon and a list in her pocket. She made a point of talking to people she'd been careful with before. Not Mabel Greer, not Dottie Briggs, but the woman who ran the small laundry on the south end of the main street, a large practical woman named Agnes Cutter, who was no relation to the settlement of the same name and who had, over the course of Evelyn's gradual appearances in town, shifted from polite distance to something approaching directness. Agnes was direct this time. "Alcott," she said, when Evelyn brought up the name carefully, framed as general curiosity. Agnes was folding sheets and did not slow down. "What do you want to know about him?" "Anything you know," Evelyn said. Agnes looked at her with the appraising look of a woman deciding how much to trust another woman. "The Heller Ranch sold in May," she said. "Ned Heller told my husband he didn't quite understand the papers he signed until after. Said Alcott's man explained it one way and it turned out to mean another." "What did it mean?" "Meant Ned got half of what he thought he was getting, paid out over time instead of up front, and by the time the final payment was due, there was a clause in there that let Alcott void it for reasons Ned couldn't make head or tail of." Agnes shook a pillowcase. "Ned's not a foolish man, but he's not a reading man either, and Alcott knew it." Evelyn stood with that for a moment. "Were all 4 like that?" she asked. "I don't know about all 4, Agnes said. "I know about Ned because Ned told my husband. The others I couldn't say." She paused and looked at Evelyn directly. "Your husband should be careful." "I know," Evelyn said. "That's why I'm asking." Agnes looked at her for another moment. A different kind of look than the first, something slightly warmer, and nodded and went back to her sheets. Evelyn drove home with Noah asleep in the wagon bed, and what Agnes had told her organized in her mind into what it actually was. Evidence. Not enough, but a beginning. Come on. She told Silas that evening. He listened the way he always listened to things that mattered, completely still, not interrupting. His coffee going cold. "Ned Heller," he said when she'd finished. Agnes seemed certain. Ned and I went to the same cattle auction 2 years running, he said. He looked at the table. He's not a man who makes things up. Then Alcott is working a pattern, she said. Yes. The question is whether he's planning to try the same approach with you or whether he'll find another way. Silas looked up. What do you mean, another way? I mean that if he already knows about us, about our situation, he may try something other than a paper trick. He might try to create the difficulty he told you he was waiting for. He was quiet. I'm not saying he will, she said. I'm saying we should know it's possible. How do you know how men like that operate? He asked. Not skeptically, curiously. I grew up watching my father lose things, she said, to men with cleaner coats than his and more words than he could follow. She met his eyes. I learned what to watch for. He held her gaze for a moment, then he nodded, once, and that was that. September settled into a pattern of its own making. Silas began paying attention to what was happening to the other ranches in the valley, with a focus he hadn't applied before. Who was buying, who was selling, what the cattle prices were doing compared to what they should have been, whether there were any patterns in the water rights that Alcott's purchases were accumulating. He was not a man who talked through his thinking, but Evelyn could see it happening, the way you could see a man measuring something even when he wasn't doing it out loud. She found herself thinking about the legal side of it. She'd never studied law and had no pretension to it, but she'd dealt with enough of the practical consequences of bad legal arrangements to understand that the protection was in the paper and the vulnerability was also in the paper, and the question was always who had read it more carefully. There was a lawyer in Cutter's Crossing named Hadley Dunn who came through Red Rock occasionally and who Silas had used once, years back, for the original land deed. She suggested Silas write to him. He did, the next day, without her needing to suggest it twice. The reply came 2 weeks later. It was thorough and not entirely comforting. There were provisions in territorial land law that Alcott could potentially exploit, particularly around water rights and shared access to the creek that ran along the south edge of the Boone property. Dunn recommended some specific filings that would strengthen Silas's position and offered to come out to Red Rock to handle them if Silas could cover his travel. Silas could, though barely. He told Evelyn the cost, which he didn't have to do, and she appreciated that he did. It's necessary, she said. It takes most of what I'd set aside for winter feed. We'll manage the feed another way. He looked at her. We. She realized she'd said it without thinking, and for a moment she wasn't sure how it would land. But he didn't look troubled by it. He looked like a man who'd just heard something he'd been waiting to hear, and was trying not to show it. We, she confirmed. Tatsia Masti. The change between them did not announce itself. It accumulated, which was the only honest way she could describe it. A season's worth of small moments that added up to something neither of them had named. It was in the mornings that she noticed it most. They had a routine now, the three of them, that had developed with the organic necessity of water finding its level. Silas was up first, always, out to the animals before the light was full. She had coffee ready when he came back in because she'd learned his schedule without planning to. And he came in at the same time within 15 minutes every day. Noah, who had become a respectable walker over the past weeks, had developed the habit of stationing himself at the door around the time Silas was due back and pointing at it with the authority of a person announcing an arrival. And Silas had noticed this, and now he said morning to Noah first when he came in, before his coffee, which was the kind of small thing that happened without being decided. She watched it and did not comment on it, and felt something in her chest that she handled carefully, because she'd learned that things handled carelessly broke. Her first husband, Daniel, who had been 24 and full of plans and energy when she married him, and 25 and gone from a sudden fever before Noah was born, which was the specific cruelty the world had seen fit to apply to her. Her first husband had been easy to love. He'd been warm and certain, and had never been quiet when he could be talking, and she'd loved him thoroughly and lost him so fast, she sometimes still woke at night with the shape of the loss fresh before she could get her bearings. Silas was nothing like Daniel. He was older and quieter, and managed 15 words where Daniel would have used 40, and there was nothing easy about him, but there was also nothing false. Not one single false thing, as far as she could tell, and she had become a careful observer. She didn't know what to call what was developing between them. She knew what she felt. She wasn't ready to examine it too directly. She gave it room instead and watched Silas give Noah his finger to hold in the morning while the coffee brewed, and she thought, this is something. She thought, I know what this is becoming. She did not say any of this. The thing that finally shifted the ground between them came from an unexpected direction. It was a Sunday in early October, and Evelyn had taken Noah into Red Rock for what she'd thought was a straightforward trip for supplies. Silas had stayed behind to deal with a section of fence that needed reposting before the weather turned. She was at Briggs's store when Mabel Greer came in. This was not unusual. Mabel came into Briggs's store regularly and had always been there when Evelyn was there, which may have been coincidence and may not have been. Usually it resolved into polite exchanges and careful silences. Evelyn had come to manage these interactions the way she managed other unpleasant necessities, steadily, without expression. But today Mabel had someone with her, a younger woman, a stranger, who looked to be recently arrived in Red Rock, the look of someone who hadn't yet learned how to wear the climate, too much fabric, too pale. And Mabel was in the mode that Evelyn had come to recognize as the performing goodness mode, the one where Mabel said helpful things to a new audience that weren't quite as helpful as they sounded. "That's Silas Boone's wife," Mabel said, in a voice pitched to Carrie. Evelyn was 3 feet away, looking at bolts of cloth. She came out from Pennsylvania. Mail order. The younger woman looked at Evelyn with wide eyes. "The baby came with her," Mabel continued. "Wasn't part of the arrangement, of course, but Silas—" She paused in the way people paused when they were about to say something they wanted to seem reluctant to say. "Silas is a generous man, always has been." The younger woman's face arranged itself into something sympathetic in Silas's direction. Evelyn turned around. "Mrs. Greer," she said. Her voice was pleasant. "I don't believe I've met your friend." Mabel startled slightly. "This is Margaret Price, just arrived last week. Her husband has the old Decker homestead." "Welcome to Red Rock, Mrs. Price," Evelyn said. She looked at the woman directly and not unkindly. "It's a hard country, but it grows on you." Then she looked at Mabel. "Silas was not deceived," she said. "He knew about my son before I arrived. He made his choice with full information." Mabel opened her mouth. "I say that not to argue with you," Evelyn continued, "but because it's true, and I'd rather it be said plainly than go on being implied otherwise." She picked up the bolt of cloth she'd been looking at and turned to Harlan Briggs at the counter. "I'll take 2 yards of this, please." She heard Mabel behind her making a sound that wasn't quite a response, and she didn't turn around, and she did not feel entirely steady inside. But her hands were still, and her voice had been even, and she paid for the cloth and walked out. She was sitting in the wagon outside with Noah when she realized her jaw ached from how hard she'd been holding it. "All right," she said, to no one. She drove home. Ted. She had not planned to tell Silas. She went back and forth on it for most of the afternoon while she worked around the house, and she'd decided by evening that she would keep it to herself, because it had been handled and because what she didn't want was for him to feel that her battles were his to fight. But Silas came in for supper and looked at her and said, "What happened?" She set down the spoon she was holding. "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "No." He sat down at the table. "Your jaw's been tight since you got back. Noah's fine, and you went to town, so something happened in town." He looked at her. "What was it?" She sat down and told him. She told him exactly because she'd learned that was the way to tell him things, exactly, without editorializing, and then let him hear it. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. His hands were flat on the table, and she watched something move through his face that he was keeping controlled only by the same discipline he kept everything controlled by. "I'm going to say something," he said, "and I want you to hear it out." "All right." He looked at her steadily. "I don't want you fighting this alone. Not Mabel Greer. Not Roy Ferris. Not Alcott. Not any of it. I know you're capable. I've never had a single doubt about that." He paused. "But there's a difference between being capable of handling it alone and having to handle it alone, and I don't want you to have to. Not because I think you can't, but because you shouldn't need to." She held his gaze. Her throat was tighter than she expected it to be. "You're not a burden I took on," he said. "You and Noah. That's not what this is. Silas, let me finish." He wasn't forceful about it, just firm. I've been trying to figure out how to say this for a while, and I'm going to say it plain because that's the only way I know. I don't regret a single thing. Not the letter, not March, not any of it. And if you're worried, if you've been carrying the idea that at some point I'm going to decide it was a mistake, I want you to put that down. She looked at him. The lamp was burning low between them, and he was not a handsome man, she thought. She'd noted that from the first day, and it still held true, but he was a real one, entirely, without seam or performance. I've been worried, she admitted. Not about you specifically, about the whole thing, about whether I made the right decision. Did you? He asked. She thought about the garden, about the night Noah's fever broke and Silas had made coffee at dawn, about the bolt of cloth she'd bought today without asking permission, about the way Noah reached for his hand in the morning. Yes, she said. I think so. He nodded once. Then that's enough, he said. The rest we figure out. What Silas did next, he did not discuss with Evelyn beforehand. She heard about it second, which was something she thought about later, that she found out second, not from him, but from Agnes Cutter, who came out to the ranch on a Tuesday morning with the kind of purposeful momentum that suggested she had made a decision and was carrying it through before she reconsidered. Agnes sat down at the kitchen table with coffee and said, "Your husband went and did something." Evelyn looked up from where she was working. What did he do? He went to the general store Saturday, yesterday, and he stood in front of Harlan Briggs and Mabel Greer and anyone else who happened to be there, and he said, Agnes paused, composing it. He said that Noah Boone would always have a place on his ranch, whatever happened and whatever anyone thought of it, and that any man or woman who had something to say about his son was welcome to say it to him directly, and he'd address it directly, but that the boy was his, and that was the end of the matter. Evelyn was very still. He said it just like that. Mostly like that. I'm paraphrasing. Agnes looked at her with a directness that was not unkind. He called the boy his son. The kitchen was quiet except for Noah, who was sitting on the floor behind her batting at a wooden spoon she'd given him. He called him his son, she said. In front of Mabel Greer and Dottie Briggs and 3 other people I could name. Agnes wrapped her hands around her cup. Mabel didn't say a word. First time I've seen that in 14 years. Evelyn turned and looked at Noah on the floor. He had gotten the spoon into his mouth and was looking up at her with the satisfied expression of a person who had solved the problem he was working on. She pressed her hand over her mouth briefly and then took it down. He didn't tell me, she said. No, Agnes said. I expect he didn't want to make a production of it. A pause. That's the kind of man he is, from what I can tell. Yes, Evelyn said. That's the kind of man he is. She heard the wagon coming back up the road from the North Range around noon, and she went out onto the porch when she heard it. Silas pulled up and looked at her standing there, and she could see him clocking that she knew because her face didn't hide things the way she thought it did, or at least not from him. He got down from the wagon. Agnes Cutter came by, she said. He nodded, didn't look away. You didn't tell me you were going to do that. No, he said. Why not? He looked at her for a moment. Because you would have told me I didn't need to. She started to say something and then stopped. Because he was right. She would have. You didn't need to, she said anyway. I know that, he said. I did it because I wanted to. She looked at him standing in the yard with the sun coming down steep from the south and his hat in his hand and his face as plainly readable as it ever got, which was not very, but enough. Noah doesn't belong to anyone's opinion, he said. He belongs here. I wanted that to be said. She crossed the yard to him, which she hadn't planned to do, and she put her hand on his arm just above the elbow, which was not much, just a touch, her hand on his sleeve. But it was the first time she'd reached for him deliberately, and they both knew it. Thank you, she said. He covered her hand with his for a moment, just a moment. Then he put his hat back on and went to see to the horse. She stood in the yard and let the October sun come down on her face and thought about Daniel, who she still loved and always would, the permanent finished shape of him. And she thought about Silas, who was entirely present and entirely real, and who had just called her son his son in front of the whole town without ceremony or announcement, like it was simply what was true. Both things could be true. She had learned that about grief. It did not require you to stop. It was carried, and you carried it, and life continued around it and sometimes through it. Noah appeared in the doorway behind her, having pulled himself up on the frame, and pointed at her from the step. "I see you," she said. He pointed more firmly. "All right," she said, and went to get him. Dun-dun-dun. The formal question of marriage had not been spoken between them directly, which was strange given that they were already married in the legal sense, had been since the ceremony in Red Rock in March, a brief, practical affair at the land office with 2 witnesses they barely knew and Harlan Briggs observing from the doorway. What they had not yet become, what they had been working their careful way toward across these months, was something harder to define and more real than whatever had been registered on that paper in spring. It was Silas who finally said it. He came in from the evening chores on a night in mid-October, when the first real cold was threading into the evenings, and the sky had the crystalline quality that the desert got in autumn, and Evelyn was putting Noah down for the night, and he waited at the kitchen table until she came out. She came out and looked at him, and his posture told her something was on his mind. She sat down. He turned his coffee cup around in his hands. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to answer it honestly and not based on what you think is practical." "All right," she said. He looked up. "Are you happy here?" She considered it honestly, the way he'd asked. Not whether she was surviving, not whether things were manageable, but whether she was happy, which was a different question, one she hadn't thought to ask herself in a long time. "Yes," she said. And then, "Not every day. Not in any easy way." She looked at him. "But the real kind. The kind that's underneath things even when the day is difficult. That kind. Yes." He nodded slowly. "And Noah?" he said. "Noah has never known anything else," she said. "This is his home. You're—" She stopped. He waited. "You're what he knows," she said. "As a father." Silas was quiet for a long moment. He set his cup down and looked at the table. She could see him working through something, and she waited because she had learned that his silences weren't hesitations, they were preparation. "I want to ask you something else," he said. "Go ahead." He met her eyes. "Do you think you could—" He stopped, tried again. "What I mean to ask is whether what you feel, whether there's room for something more than what we've had. I'm not asking out of obligation. I'm asking because I want to know." He was not a man who stumbled over words, and the stumbling was, she thought, the most honest thing she'd ever seen him do. "Yes," she said. "There's room." He let out a breath that she hadn't seen him holding. "I'm not a man who knows how to court someone," he said. "I should tell you that up front." "I know," she said. "I'm not sure I need to be courted." "What do you need?" She thought about it. "What you've been doing," she said. "The coffee in the morning, the fence around the garden, standing in front of Harlan Briggs and saying what you said." She looked at him steadily. "That's what I need." He looked at her for a long moment, and whatever he'd been uncertain of, something in him resolved. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. And they sat at the table in the autumn evening while the cold came in around the edges of the house and Noah slept down the hall, and what had been building between them through a whole long, difficult season settled at last into something that neither of them had words for yet, but both of them recognized clearly and were not afraid of. Outside, the first star showed itself over the mesa, and the desert was entirely still. Winter came to the valley the way bad news came, quietly at first, and then all at once. The October evenings had given them warning. The temperature dropped sharper than usual after dark, and the cattle moved differently, clustering near the windbreaks with the instinctive preparation of animals that understood weather better than any almanac. Silas watched them and said nothing to Evelyn, but she could read him well enough by November to know that what he wasn't saying was the part worth paying attention to. What he wasn't saying was that this winter had the feel of a bad one. They had settled into each other properly by then, not without friction, not without the ordinary difficulty of 2 adults who'd spent years alone learning to share a life, but genuinely in the way that mattered. He had moved back into the house in October, into the bedroom, and she had moved Noah's small bed into the corner of the room, and the first few nights had been awkward in the particular way of things that were real and therefore imperfect. And then they were less awkward, and then they were simply how things were. She had not expected it to feel as natural as it did, And then she had decided that natural was not quite the right word. It felt honest, which was better. He was not easy to live with in every respect. He had opinions about the placement of tools that were inflexible and slightly irrational. He went silent for days sometimes when something was working on him, and she'd learned to give those silences room rather than push against them, because pushing produced nothing but a longer silence. He left his boots where she would trip over them, not out of carelessness, but because he genuinely didn't notice where he'd put them, which she found more irritating than deliberate inconsideration would have been. She was not easy either. She knew that. She had a habit of solving problems before telling him there was a problem, which he'd told her once, plainly, made him feel like he was arriving late to a conversation that had already been concluded. She worked herself to the point of exhaustion and then was irritable about it rather than asking for help first, which was a pattern she recognized and could not quite break. She worried in ways that came out sideways, as efficiency or control, rather than as the worry it actually was. And he'd called her on that too. They were a real marriage, which meant they were sometimes a difficult one. But underneath the friction was something neither of them doubted, and that made the friction manageable. Noah, for his part, was no longer a baby in any useful sense. He was 14 months old and walking with the determined velocity of a person who had somewhere to be at all times, and his vocabulary was expanding in the unpredictable way of small children. Some words clear as a bell, others that only Evelyn could decode, and a few that seemed to be purely Noah's own invention and meant something specific to him that no one else could determine. He called Silas Da with the casual certainty of a child who has made up his mind and had been doing so since October without being taught it. And Silas, the first time it happened, had stopped entirely still for a moment the way a man stopped when something hit him unexpectedly, and then continued what he was doing without comment, which was how Silas handled things that affected him more than he wanted to show.
Ta-da!
The first hard snow came in late November, and it was harder than Silas had expected, which meant it was harder than any winter in recent memory. 8 inches overnight, and a wind that cut across the flat like it had a score to settle, and temperatures that dropped below zero and stayed there. They managed the first weeks. It was brutal work. The cattle needed constant attention. Water sources froze and had to be broken twice daily. The hay had to be hauled in weather that made every task take 3 times longer than it should. Silas worked from before light until dark, and came in wind-burned and exhausted and ate and slept and did it again. Evelyn kept the house and managed Noah and cooked and hauled water and did the 100 things that needed doing inside while outside was trying to kill everything, and they barely spoke beyond necessity some days, which was not estrangement but simply exhaustion. And then Noah got sick again. Not like the first fever, the one in April that had climbed and broken in a night, and scared her without destroying her. This was different. This was the kind of sickness that came in on cold air and found a child whose immune resources were already working against the winter stress, the kind that settled in the chest and held on. She noticed it first in how he was breathing on a Thursday morning. A slight labor to it, a new sound, not quite a wheeze, but not right. She held him and listened and felt the familiar cold run down her back. By Thursday evening, he had a fever and a cough that went deep and produced a sound she didn't like. By Friday morning, she knew she needed a doctor. She told Silas at breakfast, which was barely light, with the temperature outside at something she refused to look at directly. "How bad?" he asked. He set down his cup. "His chest is congested. The cough is getting worse." She looked at him steadily. "I can manage a regular fever. This isn't that." He looked at Noah, who was sitting in Evelyn's lap with his cheek against her shoulder, breathing in that effortful way, his eyes too bright and too glassy. "Dr. Carreau is in Cutter's Crossing," Silas said. Cutter's Crossing was 32 miles. "The pass road will be drifted." "I know. It could take 6 hours each way in this." "I know," she said again. "I'm not asking you to go. I'm telling you what I think we need." He looked at her. "I'm going." "Silas? Evelyn." He said her name the way he said it when the conversation was over, not harshly, just finally. "I'm going." He was on his horse within the hour. She watched him go from the window, his figure getting smaller against the white flat, until the snow in the distance took him, and she turned back to Noah and did what she always did when there was nothing to do but wait. She worked. She kept the stove burning hot and the house warm, which cost wood she'd been rationing. She propped Noah sitting up when he slept because he breathed better that way. She kept fluids going into him and the patient, relentless way of a woman who had survived things by refusing to stop doing the next small thing. She talked to him, which she knew he couldn't follow entirely, but which seemed to calm him. Stories and observations and whatever came into her head, a running thread of her voice to give him something to orient to. The hours were very long. She did not let herself think about the road. She did not let herself think about the pass, or the temperature, or the distance. She banked that worry down and kept it banked, because there was nothing to do with it, and it would not help Noah. What she did let herself think about, in the quieter stretches, was Silas on that horse going into that weather without hesitation, and the particular quality of that, of a man who had not been asked to love this child, who had no obligation beyond what he'd chosen to create, riding into a blizzard at first light because the boy needed a doctor, and that was simply what you did. She had loved Daniel. She thought she understood love. She was realizing, sitting in the warm kitchen listening to Noah's labored breath, that she had perhaps understood one kind of it. Silas came back at dusk. She heard the horse before she saw the lamp, and she went to the window and then to the door, and he came in with Dr. Carew behind him, a small, compact man in his 50s who shed his coat and went straight to Noah without preamble, which was the correct order of priorities, and told her something reassuring about him. Silas stood in the kitchen while the doctor examined Noah. His face was wind-raw, the kind of red that came from sustained cold exposure, and he was moving with the stiffness of a man whose muscles had spent 6 hours fighting weather. He didn't say anything. He'd done the thing and didn't need to explain it. She made him sit down and put coffee in front of him and put her hand briefly on his shoulder, which was as much as she could manage right now with Noah in the other room, and he put his hand over hers for a moment, which was as much as he needed. Dr. Carew came out 20 minutes later and told her what she'd feared but could manage. Bronchial infection, serious but not the worst he'd seen, treatable if they kept the boy warm and still and got the medicine into him consistently. He had medicine. He left it with instructions that she read 3 times to be certain she had it right. Keep him sitting up as much as he'll tolerate, Carew said. The lying flat makes it harder. Steam helps. Boil water, let him breathe near it, nothing too hot. And if the fever goes above what we discussed, you get word to me and I'll come back. He looked at Silas. You rode through that pass. Yes, Silas said. Carew looked at him for a moment. The boy's lucky, he said. Silas shook his head slightly. Just doing what needed doing. Carew stayed the night because the weather made the return trip inadvisable, and Evelyn put him in the main room with blankets and was grateful for the presence of another person in the house, though she barely slept herself, checking Noah through the night at intervals, feeling his forehead, listening to his breathing. Around 3 in the morning, the breathing changed. She was awake and at his side before she'd fully decided to move, and she sat with her hand on his chest and listened, and what she heard was better. Not well, not fixed, but the labor had eased a fraction, the way weather eased when the worst of the front had passed. She sat there in the dark with her hand on his chest and let herself be relieved, cautiously, in the careful way she'd learned to allow good things, not all at once, in case they were taken back, but gradually, like letting light into a room a little at a time. She was still sitting there when she felt Silas behind her. She hadn't heard him come in. He moved quietly for a large man, and she didn't know how long he'd been awake or whether he'd slept at all. He put his hand on her shoulder and stood there, and she leaned back against him, not much, just slightly, and he didn't move. They stayed like that for a while, in the dark, with Noah breathing better between them. Noah recovered over the following week and a half, slowly and irritably, in the manner of small children who didn't understand why they felt wrong and couldn't be told. He was demanding and clingy and slept at wrong hours and was inconsolable at others, and by the end of it, Evelyn was more tired than she'd been in the worst of summer, and Silas had the look of a man who was functioning on will more than sleep. But Noah recovered. That was the fact that contained everything else. When the boy was well enough to sit up on his own and eat and point at things with his returned authority, Silas came in from the evening chores and found Noah on the kitchen floor investigating a wooden spoon with the thoroughness of a person who had been deprived of investigation and was making up for it, and he crouched down and said, "You gave us some trouble." And Noah looked up and said, "Da," clearly and without qualification, and held up the spoon in case Silas wanted to see it, Silas took the spoon and looked at it and handed it back. "Good spoon," he said. Evelyn, at the stove, kept her face to the wall and said nothing. The Alcott matter had not gone away during the winter. It had merely waited, the way cold-blooded things waited, patient, with no need to hurry, because the conditions that favored it would come around again. They came around in February. Hadley Dunn, the lawyer from Cutter's Crossing, had come out in November as agreed and handled the filings that strengthened Silas's position on the water rights. Silas had thought that might be enough. That Alcott, finding the easier approach blocked, would move on to softer targets. What he hadn't accounted for was that Alcott had already been working a different angle, and had been working it for months, in the way that men like Alcott worked things, quietly, through intermediaries, at a level below direct attention. The intermediary in this case was a man named Burl Tanner, who worked at the Red Rock Land Office and had access to the county survey records. Silas found out about it from an unlikely source. He was at the feed store in late February when Tom Greer, Mabel's husband, a quiet man who Silas had always considered more sensible than his wife's associations suggested, pulled him aside and said low and without preamble, "Someone's been looking at your deed record, Silas. Tanner's been pulling your files. More than once." Silas looked at him. "When?" "First time in November, twice more since Christmas." Tom looked uncomfortable, the look of a man doing something he'd decided was right despite the cost of it. "I keep records of who pulls what. It's my job. I noticed the pattern." "Did you tell anyone else?" "No, I'm telling you." Tom paused. "My wife's opinions are her own. Mine are different." Silas put out his hand. Tom shook it. He told Evelyn that evening, and she was quiet in her thinking way for a moment, and then said, "He's looking for something in the deed. A gap. An inconsistency." "There isn't one," Silas said. "Dunn went over the original deed when he was here." "Dunn went over it for water rights," she said. "What about the original survey markers, the boundary lines?" He looked at her. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that if Alcott can't challenge the water rights, he might challenge the land boundary itself. If the original survey markers are disputed, if he can claim that part of your southern acreage actually belongs to adjacent land he now owns, he doesn't need to buy you out. He can litigate you out." The kitchen was very quiet. "That would take years," Silas said. "It would cost years," she said, "and money you'd spend fighting instead of ranching, and at the end of it, even if you won, you'd be diminished." She looked at him steadily. "That's the plan, I think. He doesn't need to win. He needs to make it not worth continuing." Silas sat with this. He turned it over. He could see the shape of it, now that she'd laid it out, could see how the months of Tanner pulling his files fit the pattern, how the long patience of it fit the character of a man who'd built a company on exactly this kind of attrition. "We need the original survey records," he said. "Yes." "And we need Dunn." "Yes." "And we need it documented before Alcott makes a move so that whatever he files, we can show the timeline." He looked at her across the table. It occurred to him, not for the first time, that she had a mind for this, for the hidden architecture of problems, for seeing the shape of things working against you before they completed their shape. He thought about how she'd grown up, what she'd told him about her father and the men with cleaner coats, and he understood that this ability had not come from nowhere. "When did you work this out?" he asked. "I've been thinking about it since November," she said. "I wasn't sure until Tom Greer told you about the files." "You didn't say anything." "I wasn't sure," she said again. "I didn't want to worry you about a theory." "Evelyn?" He said her name with a particular weight. "We talked about this." She held his gaze. "I know. You're right." She paused. "I'm still working on it." "I know you are," he said, not unkindly. They wrote to Dunn the next morning, and Dunn wrote back within 10 days with a response that confirmed Evelyn's reading of the situation with a specificity that made Silas's jaw tighten. There was a discrepancy. Small, the kind of thing that could be attributed to surveying imprecision in the original territory mapping, which was common, in the boundary description on the southern edge of the Boone property. Not enough to be obvious, enough to be argued, and one of the parcels Alcott had purchased in the fall abutted that southern edge. "He bought that specific parcel," Silas said. "Yes." Dunn's letter was on the table between them. Months ago, before he approached me. He identified the discrepancy before he ever came to you, Evelyn said. The offer to talk, the pleasant introduction at the land office. That was already the backup plan. He already had the boundary issue in hand. Silas stood up and went to the window and stood there for a moment. She let him have it. What does Dunn need, he asked, without turning around. He needs the original survey stakes located and documented by an independent surveyor. He needs affidavits from anyone who can speak to where those stakes have always been. And he needs it done before Alcott files anything, so the record exists first. That's a lot to do in winter. Yes, she said, it is. He turned around. Who do we know who can speak to the boundary stakes? Ned Heller worked that south range before his ranch failed, she said. He knows that land. Ned Heller sold to Alcott. Ned Heller got cheated by Alcott, she corrected. Those are different things, and a man who was cheated might be willing to help prove a pattern. Silas looked at her. Agnes Cutter told me Ned's been staying with his brother in Red Rock, she said, since the sale. He was quiet for a moment. You've been thinking about this longer than November. Since Agnes told me about Ned in September, she said. He let out a long breath that was not quite a laugh. How many problems are you solving in your head that I don't know about? Some, she admitted. I'm trying to share them earlier. Try harder, he said, but the edge was not in it. What? Getting to Ned Heller in February meant going into Red Rock, which in the continued winter was no small errand. Silas went in with the wagon on a day that had a weak sun and temperatures that had lifted enough to be survivable, found Ned at his brother's house on the east edge of town, and sat with him at a kitchen table that wasn't his own and explained what he knew and what he suspected. Ned Heller was a narrow man in his mid-50s with a face that had the particular hollowness of someone who had lost something significant and was not yet over it, which was fair because he had and he wasn't. He listened to Silas without interrupting, and when Silas was done, he was quiet for a long time. The south boundary stakes, Ned said. You worked that range, Silas said. Before. I know where those stakes are. Ned's voice was flat and certain. I know exactly where they are, because I rode that line every spring to check the fence. They haven't moved. They're where they were put in the original survey, which I have no reason to think was wrong. He paused. Alcott's people measured differently, did they? That's what we believe he'll claim. Ned looked at the table. Something moved in his face. He did the same thing to me, he said slowly, but with the water agreement. He had his man explain the water agreement on the West Creek, and I thought it meant one thing, and the paper said something else. By the time I understood the paper, I'd signed it. I'm sorry, Ned. I was a fool, Ned said, with the flatness of a man who had said this to himself many times and still hadn't found a way to make it feel different. You weren't a fool, Silas said. You were a man who trusted a straightforward explanation. That's not the same thing. Ned looked at him. For a moment, something in his face shifted toward something softer, and then it went back to the flatness. But it had been there. What do you need from me? Ned asked. An affidavit, signed and witnessed, stating where the boundary stakes are and that you've personally observed them in their location over the years you worked the adjacent range. And that helps you. It creates a record. It makes it harder for him to claim the stakes were always in the wrong place. Ned was quiet. Will it help you prove what he did to me? Silas looked at him steadily. I can't promise that. But if we can prove a pattern, if there are enough pieces of it documented, Dunn thinks there's a case that the territorial courts would look at. This was not a promise. Silas was not a man who made promises he wasn't certain of. Ned seemed to understand that. When do you need the affidavit? As soon as Dunn can come and take it properly. Then tell Dunn to come, Ned said. I'll be here. Spring came in behind the winter's cruelty with a mildness that felt almost apologetic. The snow pulled back from the valley floor through March, and the creek ran full and cold, and the cattle that had made it through, more than Silas had feared, fewer than he'd hoped, came out from the windbreaks looking rough but alive. Noah came out from the winter looking considerably better than the cattle. He was 18 months old and had emerged from the respiratory illness with what seemed like increased vitality, as if his body had fought something and found that fighting was useful. He was talking more, a jumble of real words and invented ones, and he had formed strong opinions about most things, which he communicated clearly regardless of whether anyone had asked. He had also formed a clear opinion about Silas, which had been evident for months, but crystallized in the spring into something visible to anyone paying attention. He followed Silas, not constantly, not in the clinging way of a frightened child, but with the easy, companionable following of a small person who had decided where the interesting things were happening. When Silas was in the yard, Noah wanted to be in the yard. When Silas worked at something at the table, Noah appeared at his elbow wanting to observe. When Silas came in from the range, Noah pointed at him with the announcement of someone reporting an important arrival. Silas managed this with the same practical acceptance he brought to most things. He talked to Noah while he worked, which was more than he'd ever talked to himself, narrating what he was doing, asking questions he didn't expect answers to, accepting the answers he got, which were in whatever language Noah was currently operating in. He had learned over the winter how to read Noah's signals the way Evelyn had, when the boy was hungry versus tired, when the pointing meant come here versus look at that, when the sounds meant contentment versus the beginning of something louder. Evelyn watched this without comment, because comment would embarrass Silas and was not necessary. The thing spoke for itself. In April, Dunn came out and took Ned Heller's affidavit and spent 2 days reviewing the survey records and walked the southern boundary with an independent surveyor from Santa Fe who drove stakes at the proper positions and documented them precisely and filed the documentation with the territorial court. The week after Dunn left, Alcott filed his boundary dispute. It landed at the Red Rock Land Office on a Tuesday, and Silas heard about it from Tom Greer before the ink was dry on the filing, which was the value of having Tom Greer on your side. Silas came home and put the notification on the table, and Evelyn read it carefully twice and then said, "He doesn't know about the survey documentation." "He will," Silas said. "When Dunn responds, he'll know." "Yes." She looked at the paper. "He's going to be angry." "Probably. Angry men make mistakes." He looked at her. "You're not worried." "I'm worried," she said, "but we prepared. We did what we could do, and we did it in time." She set the paper down. "Whatever happens from here, we didn't go into it unprepared." He sat down across from her. Outside, they could hear Noah in the yard. They'd given him a length of fence to push against, which he'd been occupied with for half an hour. And the sound of him there, visible through the window, conducting his business with the world, was a particular kind of anchor. "When I came to this country," Silas said slowly, "I thought the hardest part would be the land, the weather, the work." He looked at the table. "I was right about all of those being hard, but they're not the hardest part." She waited. "The hardest part is what it costs you if you try to do it alone, Wissam," he said. "I did it alone for 17 years, and I didn't understand what that cost until I had something different." She was quiet for a moment. "You're not alone now." "No," he said. "I'm not." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, the way he had in the winter dark, and she turned her hand palm up and held his. Outside, Noah had abandoned the fence in favor of something else, and was reporting this development loudly to no one in particular, his voice carrying clean and bright in the April air across the yard, out toward the greening flat where the land was waking up again after everything the winter had done to it, indifferent and resilient in the way of land, the way of things that could be knocked down and got back up and had no memory of falling. And inside, at the kitchen table, in the home they had made from practicality and stubbornness, and things that had no name except that both of them knew them, Silas Boone held his wife's hand and did not let go. That evening, after supper, after Noah was asleep, he told her the thing he'd said in the land office on that cold spring day that she hadn't been there to hear, told her what he'd said and how he'd said it, plainly, the way he said everything. She listened. "Blood doesn't make a father," he said. "Staying does." She looked at him in the lamplight. "I meant it," he said. "I know," she said. "I know you did." She reached up and touched his face, which was weather-roughed and imperfect and entirely familiar to her now, every line of it, and he turned his cheek slightly into her hand the way he did when he was letting something in, and the lamp burned between them, and the night was quiet outside. And whatever Alcott did next, whatever the territory or the weather or the years brought to bear against what they had built, it would find them standing in it together. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. Alcott's boundary dispute lasted 14 months. That was the shape of it. Not a confrontation, not a single decisive moment, but 14 months of filings and counterfilings and letters from Dunn and letters from Alcott's lawyer in Santa Fe and appearances before a territorial magistrate who seemed to regard the whole matter with the weary recognition of a man who had seen this particular kind of scheme before and was not impressed by it. The documentation that Dunn had assembled, the independent survey, Ned Heller's affidavit, the timeline showing that Alcott had purchased the adjacent parcel before approaching Silas, the discrepancy between Alcott's claim boundary and the staked positions that had existed undisturbed for over a decade, told a story that was hard to argue against without revealing exactly what Alcott had intended. Alcott tried anyway. He was not a man who accepted the failure of a plan gracefully. He filed supplementary claims and challenged the credentials of the independent surveyor and submitted his own survey conducted by a man from Albuquerque who produced measurements that contradicted the original documentation in ways that strained credibility. Dunn addressed each filing methodically, without drama, building the record piece by piece the way a careful man built anything meant to last. What broke Alcott in the end was not any single legal argument. It was Ned Heller's affidavit combined with two others that emerged as the case progressed. Ranchers who had sold to Alcott in that terrible winter, and who, once they understood that someone was building a documented case, found the courage to put their own names to paper. Men who had been humiliated by the experience, who had not spoken about it because there is a particular shame in having been deceived that makes people stay quiet, even when quiet serves the person who deceived them. Ned had spoken first. The others followed. The magistrate ruled against Alcott in June of the second year, with language in the ruling that was pointed enough to constitute a public rebuke. The Alcott Company did not appeal. 2 months later, Silas heard through Tom Greer that Alcott had moved his operation east, toward territory where the records were newer and the ranchers less organized. Silas told Evelyn on a Tuesday evening, and she received the news the way she received most things, steadily, without excess. "It's over," he said. "Yes," she said. "That's all you've got?" She looked at him across the kitchen. "I'm relieved," she said. "I've been relieved for 6 months, honestly. Once the magistrate heard the affidavits, I knew which way it was going." "You didn't say that." "I didn't want to be wrong." He looked at her. "Evelyn?" "I know," she said. "I'm working on it." He shook his head slightly, and the thing at the corner of his mouth that was almost a smile came and went. Noah, who was 2.5 and had opinions about dinner, appeared in the doorway and announced that he was hungry with the blunt authority of a person who considered this information urgent. 5 minutes, Evelyn told him. He pointed at Silas, recruiting an ally. "What she said," Silas told him. Noah assessed this coalition against him and retreated, which was the closest he came to accepting defeat. The years did not pass gently or quickly. They passed the way time passed on working land, full and hard and faster than expected when you looked back and slower than possible when you were inside them. Noah grew. This was the central fact of the years that followed, around which everything else arranged itself. He grew the way children did in the territory, quickly in the body, unevenly in everything else, all angles and speed for a while, and then settling gradually into his own shape. He had Evelyn's dark hair and her directness, and a stubbornness that Silas claimed came entirely from her side, and Evelyn claimed came from somewhere else entirely. And they had this argument cheerfully and without resolution for years. He was not an easy child, which they had both suspected from early on. He was curious about everything and patient about almost nothing, and his need to understand how things worked meant he had disassembled or attempted to disassemble most of the ranch's movable equipment by the time he was 7, not out of mischief, but out of genuine interest in the interior mechanics of things, which Silas recognized and Evelyn recognized, and which they decided to encourage rather than suppress, within limits that required regular renegotiation. He learned to ride early because the ranch required it and because he wanted to. And he was good at it in the particular way of children who are not afraid of animals and who understand instinctively that animals responded to calm rather than force. Silas taught him the cattle work patiently in the way Silas did everything, showing rather than explaining, letting the learning happen through the doing rather than through instruction, which suited Noah's temperament better than a classroom would have. He was 8 when he asked about his father. Not Silas. He'd never had any confusion about Silas, who was simply and completely his father in every way that the word meant anything to him. He asked about the man who had existed before, the one his mother had been married to in Pennsylvania, the one who wasn't here. Evelyn had known the question was coming. She'd been carrying the shape of it for years, rehearsing various versions of how to answer, and when it finally arrived, on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon when Noah was sitting at the kitchen table while she worked, and it came out of him with the casual directness of a child who doesn't yet know that some questions are heavy, she sat down and answered it honestly. She told him about Daniel Mercer. She told him he had been a good man who worked hard and laughed easily and had not had enough time. She told him that Daniel had not known about Noah, had died before Noah was born, and that if he had lived, he would have loved Noah. She was certain of that. Whatever else might have been uncertain. She told him that grief was not disloyalty, that loving Silas, which Noah had done from the beginning without being asked to, was not a betrayal of a man he'd never met. Noah listened with the serious attention he brought to things that mattered to him. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Do you miss him?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Not the way I used to, but yes." He thought about this. "Does Pa know about him?" "Yes. I told your Pa about him when we were getting to know each other." "What did he say?" She thought about it honestly. "He said that a man who was worth knowing deserved to be remembered." Noah absorbed this. "That sounds like Pa." "It does," she said. He went back to what he'd been doing, working at something with a piece of rope, a knot he was trying to learn. And the conversation was over as simply as it had begun, the way children process things that adults built walls around, directly, and then they moved on. She told Silas about it that evening. He listened the way he always listened, entirely, without interruption. "What did he do after?" Silas asked. "Went back to his knot." Silas nodded slowly. "Good." "You're not—" She stopped. "What?" "I don't know. I thought you might feel strange about it." He looked at her. "Daniel Mercer gave you Noah," he said. "That's not something I feel strange about." She held his gaze for a moment. "No," she said. "I didn't think you would, really." "Then why'd you think I might?" "Because I was watching for it," she said. "Habit." He reached over and put his hand briefly on hers, the gesture so practiced now, so embedded in the daily language of them, that it required no translation. Tiet. The school was Evelyn's idea, though it took 3 years from the idea to the building. It started from necessity. There were enough children in the surrounding ranches and the edges of Red Rock by the early years of the new decade that the lack of formal schooling had become a practical problem. Children growing without letters or numbers. Useful knowledge remaining locked in the heads of the educated few and not making it to the generation that would need it to deal with land records and water agreements and the increasingly complicated business of surviving in a territory that was changing. She had brought this up at a Red Rock community meeting in the spring. She went to these now, had been going for years, had earned her place in them gradually and without ceremony, the same way she'd earned everything out here. And the response had been generally favorable in the way of community responses to good ideas when someone else is volunteering to do the work. She did the work. She organized the families, secured commitments for materials and labor, wrote twice to the Territorial Education Office in Santa Fe until they responded, and designed a curriculum modest enough to be credible and thorough enough to be useful. Silas built the schoolhouse in the fall with help from 4 other ranchers, including Tom Greer, who had become a genuine friend over the years in the way that quiet men sometimes became genuine friends, slowly and then completely. The school opened in January with 11 students, a wood stove, a hired teacher from Santa Fe who lasted 2 years before she married and moved to Colorado, and a second teacher who Evelyn found through a correspondence that consumed most of her evenings for 3 months, and who stayed for 7 years and taught every child in the valley, including Noah. Noah was not the best student in the school. He was distractible and resistant to sitting still and had Silas's particular allergy to being told things he could figure out himself, which made conventional instruction an ongoing negotiation. But he was quick, genuinely quick, and what caught in him caught deep. He could calculate in his head faster than most adults could on paper. He read anything he could get his hands on, which was not as much as he wanted and more than most children in the territory had access to. He was also, from early, the child the other children followed. Not because he sought it. He didn't, particularly. He was not a child who performed leadership. But because he solved problems people brought to him with a directness that was his mother's, and a patience that was his father's, and a complete absence of pretension that was entirely his own. Silas watched this and said once to Evelyn, "He's going to run something someday." "He already runs things," Evelyn said. "He just doesn't call it that." "Like someone else I know," Silas said. She didn't argue with that. The ranch expanded through Noah's childhood in the careful, incremental way that sustainable things expanded. Not through ambition or luck, but through the accumulated effect of years of correct decisions. They added acreage when it became available and affordable, not before. They diversified the cattle operation with horses in the year Noah turned 10, because the demand for working horses in the territory was growing, and Silas understood horses better than most, which was a resource they'd been leaving unused. Evelyn's garden had long since outgrown the personal and become part of the operation. She supplied herbs and vegetables to 3 households in Red Rock, and had established, through several years of trial and the particular stubbornness she applied to the soil, the way she applied it to everything, a small orchard of fruit trees on the sheltered east side of the house that produced more than anyone had expected given the climate. The ranch was not wealthy. They were comfortable in the way that people who worked very hard and wasted nothing were comfortable, secure, fed, with enough margin to absorb a bad year without catastrophe, which was the only real security the frontier offered. They had been through bad years. They had absorbed them. What the ranch was real. It had the character of a place that had been genuinely lived in, that bore the marks of the people who worked it and the history they had accumulated. Visitors noticed it, the quality of the care, the way everything served a purpose and was maintained to that purpose, the absence of pretension, the presence of something that was harder to name and had to do with the people who lived there. Mabel Greer noticed it, though this took longer. Mabel had not softened overnight because people like Mabel did not soften overnight. They softened through the accumulation of evidence that contradicted their assumptions. Evidence delivered patiently and consistently over time, which was exactly what had happened. By the time Noah was 5, Mabel had shifted from pointed observation to diplomatic distance. By the time he was 8, she had made a remark at a community meeting that amounted, in the careful language she used, to a compliment about what Evelyn had done with the school effort. By the time he was 12, she had invited Evelyn to the quilting circle, which Evelyn attended twice and then declined gracefully because she genuinely didn't have the time, and Mabel accepted this with something approaching respect. It was imperfect. Real things were, but it was real. Mots. The winter Noah turned 15 was the winter Silas first got sick. It was nothing dramatic. A cough that wouldn't leave, a tiredness that accumulated differently than the tiredness of work, a gradual loss of the physical margin that had always been there. He didn't mention it for months, which was so entirely in character that Evelyn could not even be properly angry about it when she finally noticed and forced the conversation. "How long?" she said. "A while," he said. "Silas. Since December," he said. "Maybe before." It was March. She got Dr. Caro, who was older now and had trained a younger partner in Cutter's Crossing, and Caro came out and examined Silas with the thoroughness of a man who had known him for over a decade and who understood what he was looking at. The news was not catastrophic. It was not good either. It was the kind of news that meant changes, that what had always been available to him physically would be less available now, that certain kinds of work would have to be distributed differently, that the body was beginning the long renegotiation that it eventually demanded of everyone. Silas received this news with the same flat steadiness he brought to all difficult information. Noah received it differently. He was 15, which was old enough to understand what it meant, and young enough to feel it without the protective distance that adults built around hard things. He came to his father the evening after Caro left, and sat across from him at the kitchen table. The same table that had held 1,000 meals and difficult conversations and ordinary Tuesday mornings, and looked at him directly. "Tell me what you need me to do," he said. Silas looked at his son. "You're 15. I know how old I am." "The hard work. I can do the hard work," Noah said. "I've been doing it for years. I'm not asking to do it instead of you. I'm asking what you need." Silas was quiet for a moment. In the lamplight, Evelyn saw him looking at Noah with the particular look she'd seen him wear at certain moments over the years. The look of a man encountering something that surpassed what he'd expected, and finding it almost more than he could hold steady under. "The south fence line needs a full repost in spring," Silas said. "That's the hardest job. I'd have done it myself." "I'll do it," Noah said. "It's 3 weeks of work." "Then I'll start 3 weeks before it needs to be done." Silas looked at him. "I'm not doing this to take over," Noah said. "I'm doing it because you built this place, and I intend for it to stand." There was a silence in the kitchen that was not empty. "All right," Silas said. Noah nodded. He looked at his mother briefly, something passing between them that was wordless and complete, the language of people who had grown up watching each other carefully. And then he pushed back from the table and went to check on the horses for the night. Evelyn looked at Silas. "He's you," Silas said quietly. "He's himself," she said. "He's also you." She didn't argue. The south fence line got done in 3 weeks in the spring. Every post, every wire, Noah and 2 hired hands he'd organized and directed with a competence that Silas watched from a distance, with the mixed experience of a man who was proud and aware of what that pride was costing him, which was the ordinary complicated feeling of a father watching his son become capable of the things the father could no longer do. It was not simple. It was not supposed to be simple. Silas recovered some in the summer, not to what he'd been, but enough to work at a modified pace, to be present in the daily operation in the ways that still served. He shifted to the work that was less physical and more judgment, the decisions, the planning, the negotiations with buyers, and the management of the accounts, which Evelyn had always managed alongside him, and which Noah was learning with an aptitude that surprised no one who knew him. What Silas still did, every morning without fail, was walk the near range at first light. He'd done it for 30 years. It was the thing that told him what the land needed, what the cattle were doing, what the weather intended. He did it slower now, with a stick if the ground was rough, and Noah sometimes walked with him, and sometimes Evelyn did, and sometimes he did it alone, which he also needed. On a morning in September, when Noah was 16 and had been running the South operation effectively for nearly a full season, Silas and Noah walked the near range together in the early light. The air had the September quality that Silas had tried and failed to put words to across 30 years, something to do with the temperature finding its balance, and the light coming in at an angle that made the familiar look newly considered. They walked without talking for a while, the way they sometimes did, comfortable with each other's quiet. "Do you remember," Noah said, "when I was little? You told me the south pasture held more water underground than it looked like." "I remember. I want to dig test wells out there. 3 of them. See what we've actually got." Silas looked at him. "That's been on your mind a while. Since last summer." Noah looked at the pasture in question, his eyes moving over it with the reading look that Silas recognized because he'd cultivated it deliberately and been surprised to find that Noah needed no cultivation. He'd developed it on his own. "If there's water there, we can run twice the head on the south section, maybe more. It's an investment. It pays back in 2 years if I'm right about the water. And if you're wrong, then I'm wrong, and we know something we didn't know before," Noah said. "That's worth something." Silas was quiet for a moment. He looked at the south pasture, then at his son standing beside him with the easy confidence of a person who had earned the right to it through work, not assumption. He thought about a stagecoach door opening in March 20-some years ago, and a woman stepping down with a baby in her arms, and the entire town of Red Rock going quiet around him, waiting to see what he would do. He thought about how the decision he'd made in that moment had felt, from the outside, probably like a reckless thing, a man taking on more than he'd bargained for, setting himself up for difficulty, being naive about what he could and couldn't manage. He had not been naive. He had simply looked at the situation and understood what mattered and acted on that understanding, which was the only thing he'd ever known how to do. "Dig your wells," he said. Noah nodded once. They walked on. The wells produced water, not an enormous quantity, but enough. Enough to support the expansion Noah had planned, enough to change the calculation on the south section from marginal to viable. The work took the better part of the following year, between the digging and the distribution and the adjustments to the grazing rotation that the new water source required. And Noah managed it with the methodical thoroughness of someone who had been watching methodical thoroughness his whole life and had absorbed it the way children absorb the things they were raised around. By the time Noah was 18, the Boone Ranch was the most productive operation in the valley. This was not a boast. It was a fact that other ranchers acknowledged in the plain way of people who measured things objectively. And it was a fact that had come about through no single brilliant decision, but through the accumulated effect of decades of correct ones, made by imperfect people under difficult conditions with incomplete information, which was the only way any real thing got built. What happened that year, quietly, without ceremony, in the way that important things sometimes happen, was that Noah took over the management of the ranch. Not because Silas was finished. He wasn't, not in the ways that mattered, but the work had distributed itself naturally across the years, following competence and capacity. And what had emerged was that Noah made the operational decisions, and Silas was consulted on the ones that required the particular knowledge that only decades of experience in a specific piece of ground could provide. And this arrangement served the ranch and both of them. Silas did not find it easy. He would have been less than honest if he'd said he did. There was something in the relinquishing that resisted, not because of pride exactly. He'd never been a proud man in the foolish sense, but because the work had been the shape of his life for so long that its diminishment was a kind of loss that didn't have a clean name. He managed it the way he managed most things that couldn't be fixed, by acknowledging it to himself honestly and then finding what remained that was still his. What remained was substantial: the judgment, the knowledge, the daily walk. Evelyn, who was 51 and had earned a face full of weather and work and was, to him, exactly what she had always been. Entirely herself, without remainder. The kitchen table at first light, the particular quality of September mornings. Noah's voice in the yard. Enough. More than enough. There was an evening in Noah's 19th year that Silas thought about afterward for the rest of his life. It was October, which had always been the best month in the valley. Cooler, cleaner. The light doing what only October light did in this country. They were all three on the porch after supper, which happened sometimes in good weather when the day had been long and the sitting felt earned. Noah had a piece of equipment he was examining, some mechanical problem he was working through with his hands, while his mind ran somewhere else, the way he'd always done his best thinking. They were not talking about anything in particular. The silence was the comfortable kind. After a while, Noah set the equipment piece down and looked out at the land in the fading light and said, "I've been thinking about the Heller section." The Heller section was the parcel that had been Ned Heller's ranch, the one Alcott had purchased and then lost in litigation complications that had eventually returned the land to territorial disposal. It had come up for purchase twice in the past 5 years, and they hadn't been positioned to make the move. "What about it?" Silas said. "We're positioned for it now," Noah said. "We could absorb it. It would take every margin we have, and the first 2 years would be tight. And then we'd be the largest single operation in the valley, with water rights on both sides of the creek, and we could afford to run the horses the way you've always said they could be run if we had the land for it." Silas looked at him. "You've been running the numbers." "For about 6 months." Evelyn was listening with her eyes on the flat. She let them think it through. "Ned Heller would know someone bought it," Silas said. "Ned Heller would know we bought it," Noah said. "I thought about that. I thought it was the right thing rather than the wrong thing, if he knows." Silas considered this. Ned had been in Red Rock for years, in his brother's house, surviving quietly on modest means. He had grown old without the land that had defined him, and there was nothing to be done about that. And yet the idea that the Heller section would go to the people who had helped expose what Alcott had done to him, there was something in that worth thinking about. "We'd make the offer," Silas said. "Yes. And if it's accepted, we do right by that land." "We always have," Noah said. Silas looked at his son. He looked at the line of his face in the October light, the sureness in it, the quality of attention he brought to the land and to people equally, without hierarchy. He thought about the 8-month-old in a worn blanket on a stagecoach platform, and he thought about the strangeness of time, how the distance between that moment and this one was both enormous and, in some essential way, nothing at all. He thought about what he'd known on that platform, that he was looking at something worth protecting, that the arithmetic of the situation was irrelevant when set against what was actually in front of him, that some decisions weren't decisions so much as recognitions, moments when you understood what was true and acted accordingly. He had not been a man who expected much from his life, in the years before that stagecoach arrived. He had built something real out here, and he was grateful for it, but he had built it mostly to have something to do with himself, and the doing of it had been its own reward, and he had not expected more. He was not a man who expected more. He had been wrong about that. "Make the offer," Silas said. Noah nodded and picked up his equipment piece again. After a while, Evelyn said, "You knew that was what he was going to say." "For about 6 months," Silas said. She turned and looked at him. "He told you he'd been running the numbers for 6 months," he said. "He's been talking to me about the Heller section for 8. She stared at him. "You knew and you didn't." "He needed to bring it himself," Silas said. "It was his decision to make." She held his gaze for a moment, and then she shook her head slowly, with the expression of a woman who was used to being surprised by this man and found she still had not exhausted the supply. "You're something," she said. "So I've been told." Noah, without looking up from his equipment, said, "Both of you are." The offer on the Heller section was accepted in November. The first 2 years were exactly as tight as Noah had predicted, in the way that correct predictions of difficulty were not particularly comforting when the difficulty was actually present. There were months when the margin was thin enough to require decisions about what to defer, and those decisions were made carefully and without panic, and what had to be deferred was deferred, and what had to be maintained was maintained. What was never deferred was the school. Evelyn had built the school, and it was the thing she was most stubbornly attached to in all the years of her work in the valley. And the school had its own momentum now. Its third teacher, a young man from Albuquerque who was good with the older students and better with the difficult ones, an enrollment that had grown to 23 children from 11 ranches, including 2 families that had settled just to be close enough for their children to attend. Noah had, the previous spring, built an addition to the schoolhouse. He had done it with his own hands and 3 hired men over a period of 3 weeks. And when Evelyn had thanked him, he had shrugged and said the old building was too small and had been for 2 years, which was true, and which was not quite the whole truth. The whole truth was that the school was his mother's work, and the ranch was his father's work, and he intended for both of them to outlast the people who had built them, because that was what it meant to build something. You built it past yourself. He had learned this from watching. That was the thing about growing up inside something real. You absorbed it at a level below conscious understanding, and what you built when it was your turn came out shaped by what you'd been shown, even when you couldn't articulate the showing. Silas was 63 the autumn Noah married. The woman's name was Clara Reeves, daughter of a rancher on the east side of the valley, and she was sharp and capable and had, on the occasion of her first dinner at the Boone table, engaged Evelyn in a conversation about soil management that lasted through 3 cups of coffee and resulted in Clara going home with a cutting from the herb garden, which was how Evelyn indicated that someone had met her approval. Silas liked her because she didn't perform anything. She was simply who she was, in the direct way of people who had grown up working rather than performing, and she was good for Noah in the specific way of people who could hold their own against him, which not everyone could. The wedding was small, at the ranch, in October, which was the right month for it. The valley came, more people than the porch could hold, spilling into the yard, which was fine. Tom Greer was there, grayer but still quietly present in the way he'd always been. Agnes Cutter, who was 71 and had outlasted her own husband and showed no sign of slowing, sat in the best chair and observed everything with the authority of someone who had earned the right to have opinions. Even Mabel Greer came and shook Evelyn's hand at the end with a sincerity that was imperfect and genuine in equal measure, which was the best that could be asked of most things. Silas stood at the edge of the yard when it was mostly over, the way he stood at the edges of things, and watched Noah and Clara talking to a group of younger ranchers across the yard, Noah with the ease of a man who was exactly where he was supposed to be. Evelyn came and stood beside him. "Well," she said. "Yeah," he said. They stood there for a while. "Do you remember," she said, "what you were afraid of? Before March, before I arrived." "I wasn't afraid," he said. She looked at him. "I was uncertain," he said. "It's different." "What were you uncertain about?" He thought about it honestly, which he always did. "Whether I was too set in my own ways to make room for another person," he said. "Whether a woman who came out here would find it worth the price." A pause. "Whether I was the kind of man who could be a father." She was quiet. I don't think about those things anymore, he said. I know, she said. I can tell. He looked at her, at the face he'd been looking at for over 20 years, familiar in every line and expression, surprising him still sometimes, which was one of the things he had not expected from a life lived alongside someone. Was it worth the price? He asked. The coming out here. She looked at him with the expression that was entirely hers, direct, undecorated, the look of a woman who had survived enough to know the value of things precisely. You know the answer to that, she said. I want to hear it. Yes, she said. It was worth it. She held his gaze. Every hard piece of it. He nodded once. He looked back at the yard, at Noah, at the land beyond him going gold in the October light, at the schoolhouse visible above the rise, at the full particular shape of what had been built here. He was not a man given to large statements. He had said what needed saying across the years in the small, direct ways that were his nature, and it had been enough, and he believed it would continue to be enough. But there was something he had understood, standing in that yard in the October afternoon, that he had spent 20-some years understanding, arriving at it gradually, the way you arrived at the understanding of anything real. It was this, that the life you built was not made of the large decisions, though those mattered. It was made of the small ones, of staying when it would have been easier to go, of turning your hand to what needed doing rather than waiting for a better moment, of telling the truth to someone who needed to hear it and being honest when you didn't know how, of walking a fence line in the morning, not because it was heroic, but because the fence needed walking, of reaching for the hand of the person beside you, of opening your door. He had opened his door on a March afternoon in Red Rock, and everything that stood here now had come through it. The boy who had become this man, the woman who had become his life, the land that bore the mark of all of them and would keep bearing it long after. He was not a man who needed credit for the decision. He'd never thought of it as a decision worth crediting. At the time, it had simply been the only thing that made sense to do. Maybe that was the thing worth passing on, he thought. Not the land or the cattle or even the school, but the knowledge that the moments that changed everything rarely announced themselves as significant. They came quietly, in the form of ordinary choices made in ordinary circumstances by ordinary people trying to act with some basic decency in a world that made decency difficult. You kept your word. You stayed. You did the work. You made room. The rest followed. Noah laughed at something across the yard, a full, open sound. And Clara turned toward him the way people turned toward the people they'd chosen, and the October light came down on all of it. And Silas Boone stood at the edge of his own yard in the long afternoon and felt, with the uncomplicated completeness of a man who had finally stopped expecting anything other than what was real, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. That was enough. That had always been enough. He just hadn't known it yet, that March afternoon when the stagecoach door swung open and the whole world went quiet. He knew it now.
Right now I'm really into like British detective shows, and I've really like the detective shows. Like they're serious, but they're not like too serious, but they're also not too gory either, right? Like they'll show a body if it's absolutely important to the story or the plot, but they're not showing like obscene gore or trying to like cause shock value because of like the way that American detective shows love to just show so much violence. So I feel like, I guess what I'm trying to say is like when it's purposely, you know, gore with comedy, I think that that's where I can handle the gore. I don't know. I guess that's where I'm saying definitely as Robin Williams and a shit, what's his name from Fight Club? He was, oh yes, Edward Norton. Oh, really? Okay. All right, then I might have to take a look at this. I really do like Edward Norton. Of course, I fucking love Robin Williams. Robin Williams was amazing.